The convoy had been rolling for 2 hours when the world asked it to stop. Nearly 500 Harley-Davidsons stretched back along Route 9 southbound like a river of chrome and noise flags snapping from saddlebags' engines, laying down a thunder so constant it stopped being a sound and started being a weather system. People came out of gas stations to watch. Kids pressed faces against car windows. A man on an overpass held up a handwritten sign that said, "Thank you, boys." And one of the riders near the back lifted 2 fingers off his grip in acknowledgement without turning his head the way riders did when the road was good and the cause was right. The cause was the Fallen Firefighters Fund, and the convoy had raised $62,000 before a single bike had turned a wheel that morning. There would be a ceremony at the county fairgrounds in Harlan County, a stage speech as a moment of silence for men whose names were on a wall that kept getting longer every year. The riders knew some of those names personally. That was the thing nobody outside the community understood. This wasn't charity in the abstract. This was a debt being paid with diesel and noise and the kind of loyalty that didn't need a speech to explain itself. Deckard Mercer rode point. He was 58 years old and had been riding since he was 17, which meant he had spent more of his life reading asphalt than most people spent reading anything. His beard had gone gray at the edges years ago, and the rest had followed without him noticing. He wore no patches that announced rank, only a plain black vest and a helmet that had been dropped twice and replaced once after a slide on a wet mountain road in Virginia that he didn't talk about in detail, but that had permanently changed the way he took curves. His eyes moved constantly, not with anxiety, but with the quiet absorption of a man who had learned that the road communicated in small signals, and the cost of missing one was never small. He saw the shape on the shoulder at roughly the same moment his brain tried to reclassify it as something else. The mind does that. When the eyes deliver something the brain doesn't want to process, there's a fraction of a second where the visual information gets shuffled toward a safer interpretation. A bag of trash, a rolled tarp, a piece of blown tire. The brain is not dishonest. It's just trying to protect you from the weight of what seeing sometimes requires. Deckard's brain offered him 2 alternatives, and he rejected both in less than a second, because the shape was too specific, too symmetrical in the wrong places. One arm extended at an angle that didn't happen with bags or tarps, hair catching the wind in a way that only happened with hair. And the shoes. One shoe. A single worn sneaker attached to a foot attached to a leg that was not moving. He raised his left hand, 2 fingers down. The signal traveled back through the convoy the way a message traveled through water instantly and in every direction at once. Riders at the front dropped speed. Riders in the middle began fanning. Riders at the back received the signal before they could see the reason for it and obeyed without needing the reason, because that was how the convoy operated. Trust traveled the same direction as the signal. Within 40 seconds, bikes were angled across 2 lanes, light cycling engines dropping to an idle that sounded less like 500 machines and more like one very large and very unhappy animal that had decided to hold its ground. Traffic behind them erupted. Horns, a truck air brake that sounded like a cannon going off, a sedan swerving onto the shoulder before correcting. 2 riders immediately broke formation and rode backward along the jam, weaving between stopped bumpers, pointing drivers into a single organized line with gestures that left no room for misinterpretation. Another rider, a stocky man named Tully, who had worked road construction for 20 years before the knees gave out, pulled orange cones from a saddlebag and set them out with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done exactly this in other circumstances and didn't need to think about spacing. Deckard was already off his bike. His boots hit the gravel of the shoulder, and he moved toward the shape with the controlled urgency of someone who had decided that speed without clarity would make things worse. The shape became a person in the space of 3 strides. The person became a girl in 2 more. She was face down, at first one arm underneath her hair, matted against the side of her face with something dark and dried. Her clothing was wrong for the weather, and wrong for any weather, really. A shirt 2 sizes too large, thin enough to see through in the sunlight, soaked along the left side where she had been lying on wet gravel. Jeans with one knee torn open, one sneaker on one foot, nothing on the other, and the bare foot was gray with road grit and cold in a way that meant she hadn't been warm in a while. She looked younger than the situation. Behind Deckard, boots crunched on gravel as cassette hail arrived in a controlled jog. She had been riding third in the formation, which was not an accident. Cassette was 44 years old, 5'6", and had spent 16 years working trauma intake at an emergency room in Roanoke before relocating to the valley. She wore the same plain vest as everyone else, but the way she moved when things went wrong was categorically different from the way people moved who hadn't spent years operating in the space between a person being alive and a person not being alive. She dropped to her knees beside the girl without any preamble. "Check her airway," Deckard said. "Already on it," Cassette said. She pressed 2 fingers to the girl's neck. Found a pulse. It was thin and fast, the kind of pulse that was doing a lot of work to accomplish very little. She tilted the girl's chin, leaned close, listened. The breath was there, but it was shallow and irregular, like a signal fading in and out. "She's breathing," Cassette said. "Not well." Deckard scanned the girl's visible skin. The bruising on the jaw was immediately apparent, not the diffuse bruising of a fall or a collision, but the specific compact marks that happened when fingers closed around a face with force. There was a faint abrasion around the left wrist, the kind produced by something thin and rigid. Not rope, something smoother. A zip tie maybe, or a wire. "Those aren't from sleeping outside," Deckard said. "No," Cassette agreed without looking up. "Call it in," Deckard said to the rider standing behind him. The rider already had his phone up. 911 Route 9 southbound mile marker 74. Unconscious juvenile female, not a vehicle accident. Send EMS now. Cassette had pulled a small red kit from somewhere inside her vest. First aid roll, basic but comprehensive. She opened it with one hand and extracted a foil emergency blanket, with the other spreading it under the girl's upper body to interrupt the heat transfer to cold gravel. Then came the pocket mask. Grant Bishop appeared at Deckard's left. He was 51, lean, precise in movement, wearing a collared shirt under his vest in a way that looked deliberate without looking out of place. Not to the sky, but at a careful lateral. Not to the sky, but at a careful lateral angle, capturing the girl. The road. The convoy's position in the emergency cones, creating a visual record of the scene before it could be interpreted by anyone who hadn't been there. The girl made a sound. It was not a word. It was barely a breath shaped by a throat, but it was intentional. Deckard leaned down instinctively, bringing his ear closer. "Easy," he said, voice low. "You're not alone. Help is coming." The girl's lips moved. Cracked split at the corners, pale in the middle where the color had withdrawn. She was fighting for the word. It came out small and hoarse, and it sounded like it had been waiting behind a closed door for a long time. "Van." Then her eyes stopped moving under their lids and her body went slack in a way that wasn't rest. Cassette placed the pocket mask and breathed for her. Twice. The girl's chest rose barely each time, like something reluctant, like a door with a rusted hinge. Her color was wrong under the dirt. Not pale. Gray, the specific gray that happened when a body was spending everything it had on the fundamental tasks and had nothing left over for the surface. Cassette kept working. Rex Bain arrived, planted himself at the edge of the shoulder, and turned to face the stopped traffic with his arms folded and his feet shoulder-width apart. He was 6'3" and had the kind of physical presence that resolved most arguments before they became arguments. He was not a violent man by nature. He was simply a man whose size communicated that certain decisions had already been made, and the only question was whether the person in front of him understood that. A pickup driver leaned out his window and shouted something about a highway. Bain turned his head slowly and looked at the driver. The driver sat back down. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. To the people in the stopped cars, it was probably an inconvenience with flashing lights. To the people kneeling on the shoulder, it was the difference between 11 minutes and 11 minutes too late, and those were not the same thing. 2 paramedics unloaded with practiced speed, taking in the scene with the compressed visual scan of people who cataloged emergencies for a living. Cassette met them at the edge of the gravel and gave a rapid handoff. Unconscious female juvenile, estimated age 14 to 16. Weak pulse, shallow and irregular respiration, bruising on the jaw consistent with grip trauma, ligature mark at the left wrist, hypothermic presentation, dehydration, possible internal injury to be ruled out. Found face down on the shoulder, no vehicle involved. The lead paramedic's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He pulled his gloves tight and moved toward the girl with the gurney already deploying behind him. "Does she have ID?" he asked. "Nothing we found," Cassette said. Next of kin unknown. The paramedic crouched at the girl's level, adjusted the oxygen mask fit assess the IV site. His partner secured the gurney straps with clicks that sounded too loud in the relative quiet the convoy had carved out of the highway noise. Deckard stood back 3 feet and watched the professionals work. He was not the kind of man who crowded a scene to feel useful. He was the kind of man who identified where he was most needed and positioned himself there, which right now was between the ambulance and the open lane, making sure no car made any decision that required the paramedics to divide their attention. When the gurney was loaded and the ambulance doors closed, Deckard walked back to his Harley. He swung onto the seat and looked down the long double line of waiting riders. 500 helmeted faces turned toward him without coordination, without command, simply because he was the one who had stopped first, and in the absence of explicit direction, the convoy understood that whoever stopped first had the authority to start again. He raised 2 fingers and pointed forward. The convoy didn't surge. It rolled measured and deliberate, bikes falling into formation around the ambulance, like water organizing itself around an obstacle, not blocking, not pressuring, simply present in the way that 500 machines with their lights on could be present, which was in a way that made the world understand this vehicle and its cargo were not to be interfered with. People on overpasses stopped walking. Phones came up. A woman in a minivan put her hand over her mouth. The ambulance moved through the early afternoon like something urgent and important, which it was, and around it the convoy held its shape for 7 miles until the emergency entrance of St. Carver Medical came into view, and the bikes peeled smoothly away from the ambulance's path to let it reach the bay without obstruction. The hospital's automatic doors opened. The gurney went through. Deckard parked his bike and followed. Inside, St. Carver Medical smelled like every hospital, which was a combination of chemical cleanliness and something underneath it that cleanliness couldn't quite reach. The fluorescent light was the color of tired. A security guard at the reception desk had already straightened his posture in the particular way that happened when leather vests appeared in volume, not alarmed exactly, but recalibrated. The lobby filled with riders in the careful, self-organizing way the convoy had been filling spaces all day. Not a crowd, a presence. There was a difference. A crowd was noise and motion and accidental contact. This was 50 people finding walls and chairs in specific positions and settling into them with the quiet attentiveness of people who understood that their job right now was to be witnesses, not participants. Bishop found a position near the main corridor with his phone at his side, not raised, not obvious, but available. Cassette had gone through the trauma bay doors behind the gurney, her nurse's identity carrying her past the threshold that stopped everyone else. Bain stood at the junction of the lobby and the main hallway in a way that looked casual and wasn't. Deckard waited near the reception desk. A nurse in blue scrubs appeared and addressed the lobby, generally her expression, the professionally neutral one that hospitals used when the situation was unusual and the staff hadn't yet determined what kind of unusual it was. "She's being assessed now," the nurse said. "Are any of you family?" "No," Deckard said. "Then there's not much I can—" "We found her. We rode with her. We're staying until we know she's going to be okay." The nurse looked at him for a moment, not hostile, calculating. She had clearly dealt with more difficult situations than a lobby full of disciplined motorcyclists who hadn't broken anything and weren't shouting. "I understand," she said, and returned through the doors. The lobby settled into a low murmur. Someone produced a vending machine coffee and handed it off without being asked. A younger rider near the window was scrolling his phone, but his eyes kept drifting toward the corridor. An older rider with white hair sat with his hands folded and his eyes closed, which might have been sleep, but wasn't. Deckard stood and watched the trauma bay doors as if looking at them hard enough would tell him what was happening behind them. What he didn't know, what none of them could know yet, was that behind those doors in a narrow trauma bay, lit with the cold efficiency of medical necessity, a girl named Wren was already running calculations, even half-conscious, even with an oxygen mask on her face and an IV line going into her arm and a blood pressure cuff tightening and releasing with mechanical regularity. Even with her body spending everything it had on the business of remaining in the category of alive, some part of her brain that had been trained by 3 weeks of survival to never fully switch off was still running the numbers. She could feel the tube at the inside of her left elbow, which meant someone had found a vein. She could feel the foil blanket someone had put under her, the kind that crinkled when you moved and held heat the way tinfoil held it, which was imperfectly but better than nothing. She could feel the gravel grit still in her hair because nobody had washed it out yet. And she could feel with a clarity that overrode the pain in her ribs and the headache that felt like her skull was processing information slightly too large for its capacity, the small flat object taped to the inside of her left forearm. Still there. She had checked 3 times since regaining partial consciousness. The same way you checked a wound in the dark, not looking, just pressing lightly with 2 fingers to confirm the thing you needed to still be there was still there. Each time she felt the slight ridge of the tape edge and the firm flat shape beneath it, something in her chest loosened by a fraction. Not relief, something more functional than relief. Confirmation that the calculation had held. She had made the decision to take it 19 days ago. The bait yard, as the workers called it, was a distribution hub on the west side of the county, the kind of place that processed bulk freight in and out and asked the drivers very few questions. Wren had been sleeping in the drainage culvert at the south end of the lot for 11 days. It was a bad option, but it was hidden and partially sheltered and had the singular advantage of being somewhere that nobody official would look for a missing teenager because nobody official was looking for her in the first place. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a van. Not unusual. Vans came through the yard at all hours, but this one had stopped in the section that was normally unlit and unused, the section where the older containers sat on blocks waiting for documentation that never quite materialized. And the sound that followed the van stopping was not the sound of freight. Wren had pressed herself against the inner wall of the culvert and done the thing she had learned to do in moments of danger, which was to make herself as still as possible and observe with her eyes while her body became part of the architecture. She watched through the drainage grate as 2 men got out of the van. She watched as they opened the rear container bay. She watched as they pulled a third man out of the back. He was not restrained at his hands, which suggested he had been incapacitated by other means. He was conscious enough to walk barely, and he walked the way people walked when the legs were working, but the mind was elsewhere with a stumbling, mechanical compliance that was worse to watch than resistance would have been. She saw the ring on the hand of the man directing the operation, not the man walking, the one giving orders. His left hand moved in the glow of the van's interior light when he gestured, and on his ring finger was a wide gold band with something set into it, a dark stone, possibly onyx, the kind of ring that made a statement about the person wearing it beyond the fact of its existence. She didn't know his name then. She learned it later by accident when he spoke to the second man in a tone that was the conversational equivalent of a signature. He said without any particular concern for volume to make sure the access code was changed before word got there. Ward. The man being directed into the container didn't fight. That was the thing that Wren came back to afterward in the culvert in the dark on with the great pressing diamonds into her kneecaps. He didn't fight, which meant he was too far gone to fight, or he had calculated that fighting would accelerate something he was already trying to delay. Either way, the container door closed, and the man with the ring walked back toward the van, and that was when Wren, pressing her body against the concrete of the drainage channel, understood with absolute clarity that what she had just witnessed was not a transaction between consenting adults. Someone had been put somewhere they had not chosen to go. The van reversed toward the service road, moving fast. In the acceleration, a small object bounced from the van's rear lip. It hit the gravel and skittered toward the culvert grate and stopped 18 inches from Wren's outstretched hand. She looked at it. She thought about what it meant to pick it up. Not romantically, not with any particular sense of moral obligation expressed as inner monologue. She thought about it the way a person who had been alone and cold and scared for long enough thought about most things, which was practically. The object was small. It was a flash drive. She could see that clearly enough through the grate. It had come from the van. The van had been here to conduct a transaction that was not legitimate. The drive, therefore, likely contained something the people in the van cared about enough to transport physically rather than electronically, which meant it was either evidence or currency, and either way, it had value. The practical calculation was this: if she left it, the people in the van would come back for it eventually, and nothing would change. If she took it, she would have something. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, But having something was categorically different from having nothing, and she had been living on nothing for 11 days, and she understood the difference from the inside. She reached through the grate and picked it up. The following 2 days were spent acquiring supplies from a dollar store 3 miles from the yard, paying with change she had accumulated over the past week in ways that didn't require explanation. She bought antiseptic wipes, medical tape, 2 rolls of gauze bandage, and a small pair of scissors. In the culvert, with the methodical precision of someone who was good at solving problems under constraint, she created a wound dressing that wasn't. She wrapped her left forearm in gauze as if covering an abrasion, taped the drive flat against the skin beneath the first layer, and then built the rest of the dressing over it until the shape was indistinguishable from ordinary first aid. She wore a long-sleeved shirt over it at all times. If they found her, they would take her phone, her bag, her shoes. They would search her pockets and her waistband and her socks. The forearm dressing would read as an old injury. People didn't unwrap old injuries. They were squeamish about it, or they assumed the healing process was already underway and interference would complicate things. She was right about that calculation. She was almost right about all of them. 8 days after she took the drive, they found her, not at the yard. She had moved 3 times since then, staying east of the freight district, sleeping in a church parking structure, on the 3rd level where the cameras had been vandalized, then 2 nights in a laundromat that stayed open until midnight, then back to a culvert near the rail yard on the county's eastern edge. She had been careful. She had not been careful enough. They came at dusk, 2 of them in the same blue circle van, moving slowly through the underpass where she had been sheltering behind a maintenance panel. She had 3 seconds of warning, which was the sound of footsteps that were too deliberate and too coordinated for the kind of person who walked through that underpass. She ran. They were faster in the open, and the second man cut her angle before she could reach the road. They put her in the back of the van. They searched her thoroughly, professionally, without hesitation. They took her shoes because people didn't run as well without shoes. They took the small backpack with her remaining supplies. They zip-tied her wrists. They did not unwrap the forearm bandage. The driver glanced at it once, registered it as an old dressing on a homeless kid, and looked away. She rode in the back of the van for what she estimated was 40 minutes, based on turns and stops and the ambient noise of the road changing from city to highway. She did not panic. Panic was a response she had identified as expensive and largely useless in the weeks since the yard, and she had made a deliberate practice of converting what would have been panic into attention. She paid attention to the seams of the van doors. She paid attention to the way the van slowed before turns. She paid attention to the moment somewhere on the highway when the driver and the passenger began a conversation about the transfer point that was 11 minutes ahead. 11 minutes. She looked at the van's rear door latch. It was a simple bar mechanism, the kind used on commercial vans, designed to be operated from the outside, but not impossible from within if your hands were in front of you rather than behind, and hers were in front. The zip tie was tight, but her wrists could move together. She spent 3 minutes working the latch with both hands, learning its resistance, identifying the specific angle of pressure required. At the 9-minute mark, she applied that pressure. The door swung open into highway air, and the noise was enormous, and the ground was moving at 60 miles an hour below the opening, and for one complete second, she understood exactly what she was about to do, and did it anyway, pushing off the van floor and clearing the door and hitting the gravel shoulder at an angle that was survivable because she rolled rather than landing flat, and because the grass embankment absorbed the last of the momentum before she came to rest face down on the gravel with the breath knocked completely out of her. She heard the van's brakes, distant, then closer. She could not get up. The impact had taken something from her that she didn't have a word for yet, something in the chest, in the shoulder, and the left side of her head that was beyond pain and was now simply a condition, the condition of a body that had absorbed more than it could process quickly. She heard boots on gravel. She heard a voice. She pressed 2 fingers to her left forearm with the last deliberate movement she was able to make. Still there. Then the boots stopped, and she heard the reason engines, many of them, a wall of them rolling in from the distance with the accumulated weight of something much larger than 2 men in a van. She heard the van door slam. She heard the engine accelerate away. She heard the engines grow louder and closer, and then she heard boots again. Different boots, a different weight, a different intention, and a voice that said, quietly with no performance in it at all, "Easy, you're not alone." Help is coming. She had been holding on to consciousness by a single thread, and the voice cut it. Not because it frightened her, because it was the first voice in 19 days that she had not needed to be afraid of. The forearm dressing was the only piece of actual preparation that had survived everything. She had checked it with 2 fingers for the 7th time as the trauma bay nurses worked around her, and it was still there, and that was enough for now. She kept her eyes closed and listened. She had learned in the weeks of sleeping in places where danger was ambient that you could reconstruct a room from sound with reasonable accuracy. She counted voices. She tracked movement by the sound of shoe soles on linoleum. She registered the sequence of actions being taken with her body and identified each one against a mental inventory of what was a threat and what wasn't. The IV line was not a threat. The blood pressure cuff was not a threat. The oxygen monitor on her finger was not a threat. The door opening a 3rd time quietly after the nurse and the paramedic had both established a rhythm that didn't include a third entry was something she filed differently. New footsteps, heavier than the nurses. Official in a way that was not medical, the wait-forward stride of someone who walked into spaces with the assumption that the space would accommodate them. Wren did not open her eyes. She heard the person stop at the foot of her bed. She heard the quality of his breathing controlled and deliberate in the way people breathed when they were managing an internal state they didn't want visible. Then he leaned forward, and she felt the displacement of air that happened when a body moved into proximity, and his voice came low and close, barely above a whisper. "Give it back," he said, "and you go home." He straightened. His shoes moved toward the door. The door opened and closed. Wren lay still for 20 seconds. Then she opened her eyes for the first time since losing consciousness on the highway shoulder. The trauma bay had low lighting at the perimeter and bright lighting directly overhead. She blinked against it. A nurse at the supply cart turned and saw her eyes open and crossed to the bedside and began the standard assessment questions. What day was it? Did she know where she was? Could she follow the pen light? Wren answered correctly on all counts, which seemed to both please and slightly surprise the nurse. "You're at St. Carver Medical," the nurse said. "You were found on the highway. Some people from a motorcycle convoy called 911 and stayed with you. You're safe." Wren considered this sentence carefully. Safe was not a word she was prepared to accept without specifics. "Who else has been in this room?" she asked. The nurse hesitated, which told Wren something useful. "A police officer came by briefly," the nurse said, "just to check on you." "What did he look like?" The nurse described him in general terms. Average height, dark uniform, late 30s. "Did he have a ring?" Wren asked. "On his left hand, gold. Dark stone." The nurse's expression shifted into a category Wren couldn't fully read, but the pause before the answer was informative on its own. "I didn't notice," the nurse said, "but I can con." "I need to see the woman who helped me on the road," Wren said. "The nurse who was with the motorcycles. I need to see her before I talk to anyone else." The nurse looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations of a patient in this age bracket. Then she nodded and left. Cassette Hale came through the trauma bay door 3 minutes later. She had changed nothing about herself since the highway, same vest, same controlled expression, same eyes that took in the room and made a rapid assessment before she had technically finished walking through the door. She stopped at Wren's bedside and looked at her the way medical professionals looked at patients when the patient was awake and seemed more coherent than expected. "You asked for me," Cassette said. "You're a nurse. ER trauma intake." Wren studied her. She had become reasonably good at identifying people who meant what they said, not because she had some innate gift for it, but because she had been wrong about people with expensive consequences and had spent the subsequent time recalibrating. Cassette read in her silence and her steadiness as someone who would not perform a reaction she wasn't having. "There's a man outside," Wren said. "Or there was, a police officer, gold ring on his left hand, dark stone. He came in here and told me to give it back or I'd go home." Cassette said nothing for 2 seconds, which was longer than a person who hadn't understood the sentence would take to respond. "Give what back?" Cassette asked. Wren looked at her and said nothing, which was an answer. Cassette exhaled slowly through her nose. "Is what he wants something you currently have with you?" Wren didn't answer that either. "Okay," Cassette said. "Okay." She straightened, made a small internal decision, visible only in the set of her jaw, and pulled out her phone. There's a man outside named Deckard Mercer. He organized the convoy. There's also a man named Grant Bishop who knows law. I'm going to bring them in as your advocates before we go any further with hospital staff or police. Is that all right? Wren looked at her for another 3 seconds. Okay, she said. They came in quietly, Deckard and Bishop, without the theatrical weight that some men brought into rooms. Bishop positioned himself near the door with his phone in his hand, camera not raised but available. Deckard stood at the bedside with his arms at his sides and his hat removed, which was a gesture Wren noted as something that had been taught rather than performed. You're the one who stopped, Wren said. Yes, Deckard said. Why? He looked at her without the quality of someone manufacturing sincerity. Because you were there, he said. Wren decided that was sufficient. She told them about the man with the ring. She told them about what he had said to her in the trauma bay. She told them about the yard and the container and the vein and the drive. She told them about the 8 days afterward being found, the zip ties, the 40 minutes in the back of the van, the door latch, the highway. She did not tell them where the drive was, not yet. There's going to be someone who shows up claiming to be my family, Wren said. He'll have paperwork. He'll have everything you need. He'll be very prepared. Deckard and Bishop exchanged a look. How do you know that? Bishop asked. Because that's the kind of operation it is, Wren said. They plan for the variables. A homeless girl ends up in a hospital. You create a family member to collect her before the system has time to build a file. The paperwork is probably already printed. Bishop was already typing something on his phone. When he shows up, Wren said, I need you to not let the hospital hand me to him before I can demonstrate that he doesn't actually know me. She paused and something moved across her face, not fear exactly, more like the specific fatigue of someone who had been doing complex work for a long time on insufficient resources. He won't know the answer to something personal, something simple. I need someone to ask him. What do we ask? Cassette said. Wren thought for exactly 2 seconds. Ask him the name of the street I grew up on, she said. If he's real family, he'll know. If he's not, he'll hesitate or make something up, and you'll be able to tell. Bishop looked at Deckard. Deckard looked at Bishop. That's your tell, Deckard said. That's my tell, Wren said. Cassette was already at the door. Graham Ward arrived in the lobby 40 minutes after Wren was moved to room 312 on the 3rd floor. He came through the main entrance with the particular quality of presence that distinguished people who belonged in rooms from people who had decided they belonged in rooms. He wore a suit that was clean without being formal, the kind of suit that communicated competence without requiring interpretation. His hair was dark and precisely arranged in a way that suggested care without vanity. He carried a thin folder under his left arm, and his right hand was extended in greeting before he had fully located the person he was greeting. The hospital administrator, a woman named Sharon Coates, who had spent 14 years managing the gap between medical necessity and institutional anxiety, moved toward him with the barely concealed relief of someone who had been watching 500 motorcycle people fill her lobby for the past hour and was now being handed a neat professional solution. Thank you for coming so quickly, she said. Of course, Ward said. His voice was moderate, practiced, carrying the precise amount of warmth that didn't read as performed. I came as soon as I got the call. Wren's been difficult lately, running off, not taking her medication. We've been frantic. He said the word frantic with exactly the right amount of distance, the distance of a man who had been so frantic for so long that the word had been domesticated. We'll need to verify, the administrator began. Of course you do, Ward said, already opening the folder. I anticipated that. He laid papers on the counter with efficient movements. Guardianship documentation, medical history, release authorization. The paperwork had the slightly too crisp quality of things that had been printed recently and organized before they were needed. He said everything with the satisfaction of a man who had used the word before. Deckard watched from 12 feet away. He had positioned himself casually against the wall near the corridor entrance, which was not casual at all. Bishop was 6 feet to his left with the phone at his side. Cassette had gone upstairs to the 3rd floor where Wren was being settled. The administrator was reaching for the tongue page. Deckard could see her fingers curl around it, the way people grab paperwork that promised to end an uncomfortable situation With an urgency that wasn't quite professional. He crossed the 12 feet in a controlled line. "Can I ask you something?" he said to Ward. Ward turned with the practiced patience of a man interrupted during important business. His expression had not changed, which was itself informative. Real family interrupted at a moment of potential reunion changed expression. They shifted toward the corridor, toward the room, toward wherever the person was. Ward shifted toward Deckard, which meant his attention was on the conversation, not on the girl. "Of course," Ward said. "The name of the street she grew up on," Deckard said. Ward's eyes held steady. "I'm not sure I understand." "Simple question," Deckard said. "If you're her family, you'll know where she grew up. What was the street name?" Something happened in the space between Ward's next breath and his next word. It was not large. It was not the obvious hesitation of a man confronted with a lie he hadn't prepared for. It was smaller than that, the slight forward tilt of someone whose mental machinery had engaged for 1/4 second too long before producing an answer. "That's an unusual thing to ask," Ward said. "I'm her uncle. I have documentation." "Street name," Deckard said. Bishop's phone at his side tilted to a slightly different angle. Ward shifted the folder and produced what he clearly intended as his final word on the subject, a driver's license which he placed on the counter beside the paperwork. His name was Graham Ward. The address was in the next county. "I appreciate your concern," Ward said to Deckard in a tone that was the verbal equivalent of a door being firmly but politely closed. "But this is a family matter and I'd like to focus on Wren's care." "What medication?" Cassette's voice came from the direction of the elevator. She had come back in without anyone noticing. She walked toward the desk with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly where she was going. "You said she hasn't been taking her medication." "What medication?" Ward looked at her vest, read the road name on the patch, recalibrated visibly, though he would have said he hadn't. "Medication for anxiety," he said. "She struggles with it. She gets overwhelmed and she runs." "Name it," Cassette said. "I'm not a pharmacist." "You're her guardian," Cassette said. "You have a medical history folder in your hand. The information is in there or it's not. If it's not, that's interesting. If it is, you already know the answer." Ward's smile held, but the warmth behind it had gone technical. It was the smile of a system running on reserve. "This is inappropriate," he said, addressing the administrator now. "I understand that these people have some emotional investment in the situation, and that's commendable. But I am her legal guardian. I have documentation. I have verified identification. This woman is a motorcycle rider, not a medical professional, and she doesn't have standing to interview me." "Actually," Cassette said, "I'm a licensed trauma nurse and a mandated reporter, and I've identified markers on this patient consistent with restraint and possible assault. That gives me standing to ask questions of anyone claiming custodial authority until the appropriate social services protocols are completed." Ward's smile thinned to a line. "And," Bishop said, not moving from his position, phone tilting another degree, "you still haven't answered either question." Atijah, the administrator, had stopped reaching for the paperwork. In the quiet that followed, the lobby around them was not loud, but it was full. Riders who had been sitting or standing with apparent casualness had, over the course of the last 90 seconds, shifted their positions by small increments. Not a threat, not a posture, just presence redistributed. Ward looked at the room for the first time as a room rather than as a desk he was conducting business at. He saw the faces, saw what they communicated, which was not hostility. Something more settled than hostility. Hostility changed its mind. This wouldn't. His jaw tightened by 1 millimeter. "This is not the end of this conversation," he said to the administrator, in a voice designed to remind her that she operated within a system that was larger than this lobby. Then he closed his folder, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the exit with the composure of a man who had decided that a tactical withdrawal was not a defeat. He went through the sliding doors without looking back. Deckard watched him cross the parking lot through the glass. "He'll be back," Bishop said quietly. "Yes," Deckard agreed, "or someone will." Upstairs in room 312 on the third floor, a monitor beeped with the steady reliability of a kept promise. A girl lay in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a bandage on her left forearm that was not entirely what it appeared to be. The door was closed. The light was low. A chart on the outside of the door had a name on it that wasn't her name because they didn't know her name yet. And that anonymity was for the moment the only thing besides the drive she had managed to hold on to. Deputy Harlan Rusk had left the building 40 minutes ago. He had left the way he came. Through the emergency entrance badge on his chest hand, near his belt posture, announcing that everything here was under control and proceeding as it should. He had nodded to the charge nurse on the way out. He had acknowledged the administrator with a slight dip of the head that passed between people who understood each other without needing to enumerate the terms. He had not looked at the lobby full of bikers on his way past. He got into his cruiser and drove out of the St. Carver Medical parking lot and turned south on Route 9. He drove for half a mile, pulled onto a service road and stopped. He picked up his personal phone, not his department phone, and typed one sentence. "The girl is here. She has it with her." Then he sent it and set the phone face down on the passenger seat and stared through the windshield at the scrub brush on the side of the service road. He thought about the ring on his finger. He turned it once with his opposite thumb, a habit he had developed years ago in circumstances he no longer thought about in specific terms. It was just a ring now, just gold and stone and the faint indentation in the skin beneath it that happened when you wore something long enough. His phone buzzed once. He read the reply, nodded once, turned the cruiser around and headed back toward the hospital. Back in the lobby, Deckard had not moved from his position near the corridor entrance. The riders around him had resettled into their positions with the patience of people who understood that what they were doing now was not dramatic but was necessary, which was holding a perimeter that couldn't be allowed to have gaps. He thought about the word Wren had said on the highway's shoulder, the only word she had managed before losing consciousness again. Van. He turned it over. One word from a girl who was barely here and then was barely gone and was now barely back. She had said it like it meant something specific. Not like she was confused, not like she was describing the thing that had left her on the shoulder. Like it was a report, like she was filing information before the window closed. He thought about the bruise on her jaw, the mark at her wrist, the single shoe. He thought about Ward's pause before the street name question. He thought about Russ coming in while she was still in the trauma bay, before anyone had organized, before there was any reason for a local deputy to be here unless someone had called him. The pieces were not arranged yet into a shape he could name, but pieces that didn't arrange themselves quickly sometimes arranged themselves all at once, and Deckard had been around long enough to know that when they did, you either had your feet under you or you didn't. He intended to have his feet under him. Cassette reappeared from the corridor direction and crossed to him. She kept her voice below the ambient level of the lobby. "The charge nurse is being pressured," she said. "Administrator wants to move things along. Someone is going to push for Ward's documentation to be accepted." "On what grounds?" Bishop asked, arriving at Deckard's other side. "Pressure doesn't always need grounds," Cassette said. "It just needs a direction and enough force." "Then we add friction," Bishop said. Deckard looked toward the elevator bank. "She asked for something," he said. "Before Ward showed up, she asked for us to verify the guardian claim before the hospital made any decisions. That's a request from the patient." "She's a minor," Cassette said. "She's a minor who was found with the restraint marks and asked a coherent, specific strategic question within 40 minutes of regaining consciousness." Bishop said, "I'd like to see the documentation Ward provided." "You can request it as her advocate," Cassette said. "Informal, not legal, but you can request it." "I'm going to request it," Bishop said. "And I'm going to call for social work," Cassette said. "Formally, on the record, with my name attached." Deckard nodded once. Outside afternoon was becoming evening, the light going from flat gold to flat gray, in the way that happened fast in October in this part of the country, like the day was not fading but withdrawing. The parking lot filled the wide windows of the lobby with the dim shapes of 500 parked motorcycles chrome, catching what light was left a sight so singular and strange that the security guard at the desk had stopped pretending not to look at it 20 minutes ago. The elevator opened, and a woman in hospital administration clothing stepped out and made eye contact with no one specifically, which meant she was looking for someone specifically. Her gaze landed on Deckard. "Deputy Rusk is back," she said not loudly. "He's asking to come up to the third floor to check on the patient." The lobby did not go loud. The lobby went quiet. There was a kind of quiet that a room full of people produced when they had all registered the same information at the same moment and arrived at the same conclusion without saying it out loud. It was not silence. It was something denser than silence. It was the sound of 500 people deciding that the next few minutes mattered. Deckard looked at Cassett. Cassett looked at Bishop. Bishop's phone came up and the camera turned on. "Tell him," Deckard said to the administrator in a voice that was completely level, "that the patient is under mandated reporting protocols and access is being evaluated by social work. I can't just—" "Then we'll go up," Deckard said, "and we'll tell him ourselves." The third floor of St. Carver Medical was quieter than the lobby, in the way that hospitals were always quieter. The higher you went, as if altitude softened things, as if the distance from the entrance created a buffer between the world outside and the business being conducted within. The hallway carpet was a muted institutional blue. The overhead lights ran lower than the trauma bay below, which was a design choice meant to communicate that this floor was for recovery, not emergency, that the acute phase had passed, and what remained was the slower, less dramatic work of getting better. Wren did not feel like she was getting better. She felt like a person who had been retrieved from one kind of danger and placed inside a building that contained another kind, and the walls and the carpet and the dimmed lights were details that belonged to a different narrative than the one she was actually inside. She lay in the bed and performed stillness and listened. The monitor beside her beeped with the steady arithmetic of a body doing its minimum required work. The IV bag above her had been changed once since she arrived on this floor, which meant at least 40 minutes had passed, possibly more. She had been asked her name by 3 different people: a nurse during the transfer, a technician during the blood draw, and a woman with a clipboard who identified herself as patient services. Wren had given them nothing on that front, not from obstruction, but from calculation. Her name was in the system somewhere, or it would be soon, and once it was, it would become available to people she didn't want it available to. The longer the chart said Jane Doe, the longer that particular variable stayed controlled. She had asked for Cassette Hale twice and been told she was downstairs. She had asked about the police officer with the ring and been told he had left the building, which was information that had the shape of reassurance but didn't function like it. The door to room 312 opened, and a security guard stepped in. Wren registered him before he spoke. The uniform was correct, the ID badge was clipped at the right height, but something about the way he entered was wrong. Hospital security entered patient rooms with a particular deference. Even when they were performing a function, they angled their body toward the patient's face and spoke first. This man entered with his eyes on the room rather than on her, scanning corners, checking the bathroom door, the window, the position of the bed relative to the exit, the way a person entered a space they were assessing rather than serving. He looked at her, looked at the monitor, looked at the bandage on her left forearm for exactly about 1 second longer than was appropriate. "Just doing a check," he said. "Okay," Wren said. He positioned himself near the door and did not leave. Wren looked at the ceiling and thought about the drive, and thought about the way Ward had not known the name of the street, and thought about the fact that the man in this room was not a hospital security guard, even though he was wearing the uniform of one. She closed her eyes and waited for Cassett. Downstairs, the lobby had reorganized. The administrator had delivered Deckard's message about mandated reporting protocols to Deputy Rusk, who had received it with the patient expression of a man who understood that the direct route had been temporarily blocked and was already identifying the alternate routes. He had thanked her pleasantly, told her he would wait, and sat down in a chair near the elevator bank that gave him a clear line of sight to both the main entrance and the corridor that led to the stairs. Deckard watched him sit down and chose not to sit. He stood at the edge of the lobby with his arms loose at his sides and looked at Rusk with the open, uncomplicated directness of a man who saw no reason to be subtle about the direction of his attention. Rusk, after a moment, looked back. Neither of them said anything. Bishop was at the desk with the charge nurse requesting formally, and by name, a copy of the guardianship documentation Ward had presented, on the grounds that he was functioning as an informal patient advocate in the absence of confirmed family. The charge nurse looked uncomfortable in the way people looked when they were being asked to do something procedurally legitimate that their supervisor had implicitly suggested they not do. Bishop did not raise his voice. He did not produce credentials. He simply stood there with his phone in his hand and his posture communicating that he had all the time in the world for this particular conversation and was prepared to have it in writing if necessary. Cassette came back from the third floor. She crossed to Deckard and kept her voice low. The guard outside her room wasn't on the roster when I asked the charge nurse up there, she said. She checked the assignment log. Nobody from the security office was scheduled for that post. Deckard turned this over once. Posted by who? The charge nurse didn't know. She said someone from administration came up and said a guard had been requested for the patient's room given the circumstances. She assumed it was standard. It's not standard, Cassette said. Assigned security for a patient room of this category gets logged specifically. The nurse who checked said the log entry for the room has no badge number attached to it. Bane had materialized beside them in the way Bane materialized without apparent transit from one location to another, simply present where he had not previously been present. He said nothing, but the angle of his head communicated that he was listening. I need to go back up, Cassette said. I'll come, Deckard said. Not yet, Bishop said, arriving from the direction of the desk. Rusk is watching the elevator. He paused. Take the stairs. They took the stairs. The stairwell was concrete and fluorescent and indifferent to the specific drama moving through it. Cassette's footsteps were quiet. Deckard's were louder but not loud. They moved with the efficiency of people who had identified a window of time and understood that windows closed. On the third floor, the corridor was as Cassette had described. Muted carpet, low light, a row of family chairs under art prints that had been selected by someone who believed that nature photography could absorb human anxiety. The door to 312 was visible from the stairwell, landing 40 feet down the hall, and outside it stood the security guard Cassette had mentioned in the correct uniform with the incorrect posture. Cassette kept walking toward the room with the confidence of a medical professional approaching a patient. Deckard walked beside her with the confidence of someone who had not been told he couldn't be here. The guard saw them coming and straightened. Visiting hours are, he began. I'm the nurse who performed airway management on this patient on the scene, Cassette said, not slowing. I have a clinical interest in her status, and I'm here in that capacity. I still need to... Is your badge number logged with the security office for this post? Cassette asked, still not slowing. The guard's mouth opened, closed. Cassette stopped 2 feet from the door. Because the charge nurse on this floor checked the assignment log, and it doesn't have a badge number for your post. So either there's a logging error, which can be resolved in about 45 seconds with a call to your supervisor, or there's a reason you're not in the log, which is a different kind of problem. She looked at him steadily. Which one is it? The guard looked at Deckard, then back at Cassette, then at the door behind him. His right hand moved toward his radio and then stopped before reaching it, which was the most informative thing he had done since they arrived. Cassette pushed the door to 312 open and walked in. The room was dim. The monitor beeped. The IV bag hung. Wren lay with her eyes closed and her breathing visible in the slight rise and fall of the thin blanket. And in the corner near the door, standing with his back to the wall, and his eye on the bed was the guard Cassette had mentioned, the interior one, the second one nobody had known was there. He turned when the door opened. He was wearing the right scrubs. He was wearing the right ID badge lanyard, though the badge itself was flipped inward against his chest, so the printed side faced his sternum. His posture was not the posture of a person whose job was to be in this room. Wren's eyes opened. She looked at Cassette, she looked at Deckard, she looked at the man in the corner in a way that contained several weeks of accumulated recognition and said nothing at all with her expression, which was itself a kind of answer. Who assigned a you to this room? Cassette said to the man in the corner. Administration, he said. The word was smooth, practiced the single-word answer of someone who had anticipated this question and selected the response most likely to end the conversation. Administration name, Cassette said. He paused. Name, Cassette said again, the same word, the same tone, zero escalation, simply the repetition of a request that had not yet been fulfilled. The man in the corner did not provide a name. He looked at the door at Deckard, at the monitor, at the position of the bed relative to the window. Wren sat up. It cost her something to do it, visible in the way her jaw tightened and her left arm pressed against her side. She pushed herself upright against the elevated head of the bed and looked at the man in the corner with the directness of someone who had decided that performing vulnerability was no longer in her strategic interest. He's not from the hospital, Wren said. The man in the corner made a decision, a stillness that was actually a gathering, and then he stepped toward the door with the controlled urgency of someone who had calculated that leaving was better than remaining, and Deckard was already in the doorway. He stopped. Bane appeared behind Deckard in the doorway, filling the remaining space with the geometric efficiency that large men in doorways accomplished, without trying. The man in the corner looked at the available options, which had reduced substantially. "Hands where I can see them," Deckard said. Not a shout, a statement of terms. The man put his hands up, palms open, and his expression settled into something calculating and patient, the expression of someone who had been caught in a forward position and was now waiting for the next piece of the operation to arrive. Cassette crossed to Ren's bedside without looking at the man in the corner because the thing that needed her attention was not the threat, it was the patient. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," Ren said. "He didn't touch me, he just stood there." "How long?" 10 minutes maybe, since before you came up." Cassette looked at the bandage on Ren's left forearm with the clinical attention she had been exercising since the highway, and then she looked at Ren, and Ren looked back, and something passed between them that was not quite a conversation and not quite a decision, more like an acknowledgement that the moment for certain information to be contained had passed, and the moment for it to be useful had arrived. "I need to check something," Cassette said. "I'm going to look at your arm. Is that all right?" Ren held out her left arm. Cassette peeled back the edge of the bandage with the careful precision of a person who understood that what was underneath was medical and also not medical. The first layer of gauze came back, then the second, and there taped flat against the skin with the methodical efficiency of someone who had solved a practical problem under significant constraint was a flash drive no larger than a first joint of a thumb, matte black, entirely unremarkable in every way except for its location and the 3 weeks of survival strategy that had kept it there. The room was very quiet. "That's what they want," Ren said. Deckard looked at it. Bishop, who had arrived in the doorway sometime in the last 2 minutes, looked at it. The man in the corner looked at it too with the focused attention of someone who had been looking for something and had finally located it. "Don't take it off yet," Bishop said. "Not until we have chain of custody established." "I know," Cassette said. She pressed the bandage back into place. Ren looked at Deckard. "I'll tell you what's on it," she said, "but first you need to understand why they want it back." She paused, organizing information for maximum clarity. 19 days ago, I was sleeping near a freight yard on the west side of the county. In the middle of the night, a van came in. Blue circle logo on the side, white letters that looked like a wave. They put a man in a container. Not cargo, a man. I saw it. Nobody spoke. "I heard a name," Ren said. "Ward, and I saw the ring, on his left hand. Gold band, dark stone." She looked at Deckard. "The same ring the police officer who came into my room was wearing when he told me to give it back." Bishop's phone was up. Recording. "They chased me," Ren said. "They caught me 8 days later, tied my wrists and put me in the back of their van." She looked at the mark on her wrist that the nurses had photographed, but hadn't yet explained to anyone's satisfaction. "I got the door open while we were on the highway. I jumped. That's how I ended up on the shoulder." She said it without drama, the way a person described a calculation that had worked out approximately as intended. "I kept the drive because without it, nobody would believe what I saw. A homeless 15-year-old girl with no ID and no address saying she witnessed something at a freight yard at 3 in the morning. Without the drive, that's nothing." She looked back at Deckard. "With it, it might be something." Deckard nodded slowly. "They've been looking for you for 19 days, he said. "Yes," Ren said. "And someone with a badge found you," he said. "Before we did." Ren's jaw tightened. "He was at the yard that night," she said. "The ring. I saw it in the van's light. I didn't know he was a deputy until he walked into my trauma bay wearing a uniform." The silence in the room had weight to it. Cassette was already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the charge nurse," she said. "And then I'm calling state." "Call state first," Bishop said. She did. Downstairs, the lobby had shifted in the minutes since Deckard and Cassette had gone to the stairs. The shift was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happened when a large group of people received information through a network that didn't require words. The slight repositioning of bodies, the incremental closing of gaps, the redistribution of attention from general to specific. Rusk was still in his chair near the elevator bank. He had been watching the elevator with the patience of a man waiting for a number to appear on a display. When it opened and a hospital technician emerged wheeling a cart, his eyes went briefly to the opening and then returned to the lobby. When it opened again and two nurses stepped out mid-conversation, same response. He was watching for specific people. His personal phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He read the message. Read it again. His expression did not change because he was practiced at expressions not changing, but something behind his eyes recalculated at a speed that had nothing to do with calm. He stood, straightened his belt, and walked to the elevator. The elevator opened on the third floor with the soft chime that elevators in hospitals used instead of the harsh sounds they used everywhere else. Rusk stepped out and turned toward room 312 and stopped. The corridor was not the corridor he had anticipated. There were bikers in it, not a group clustered near the elevator, not people waiting in the family chairs. People distributed along the length of the hallway with the deliberate spacing of individuals who had been told where to be and understood why. A man the size of a load-bearing wall stood 6 feet from the door to 312. A woman with her phone to her ear stood 12 feet further down, speaking in a measured clinical voice that carried without being designed to carry. And at the far end of the corridor near the stairwell door, two more riders who had positioned themselves with their backs to the wall and their eyes on the hallway. Rusk assessed this in the 2 seconds he had before his arrival became fully registered. He chose his face and started walking. "Deputy Rusk," the charge nurse said, appearing from the nurse's station with the energy of someone who had been waiting for this arrival without wanting it. "I need to verify your authorization for this floor." "I'm here as a courtesy," Rusk said, following up on the juvenile patient. He kept his pace easy, unhurried. "No authorization required for a welfare check." "We've had some concerns raised about access to this patient," the nurse said, walking them beside him now. "The attending physician has placed the patient on restricted visitor status pending social work assessment." "I'm not a visitor," Rusk said. "Not a bishop," he said from his position against the wall. "You're a person the patient has identified as being present at the location where she was harmed." Rusk stopped. He turned toward Bishop with the measured rotation of a man turning toward a problem he had not yet decided how to categorize. Bishop was holding his phone with the screen visible, but not aggressively raised, capturing the hallway, the door number, Rusk's face, the surrounding context. "That's a serious allegation," Rusk said. "It's a patient statement," Bishop said, "given twice, in the presence of medical staff." "A minor statement," Rusk said. "A minor who was found unconscious on a highway, possibly delirious, certainly traumatized. Plus, delirious people don't identify specific anatomical details on specific individuals." Cassette said, emerging from room 312 with the door clicking shut behind her. "She identified a ring, left hand, gold band, dark stone. She described it to us before she knew you were a deputy, before she knew your name, before she had seen you again." She paused. "That's not delirium. That's memory." The hallway was very quiet. Rusk looked at Cassette with the expression of a man revising a calculation in real time. He had come up here expecting to manage the situation separating the girl from the witnesses. He had not expected the witnesses to have already built a structure that made separation complicated. "You're a nurse," he said. "I'm a mandated reporter," she said, "and I've filed. State has been contacted. Social work has been contacted. The patient's status is formally flagged as suspected assault with a potential conflict of interest involving local law enforcement." Rusk's jaw moved once. He reset it. "I'd like to speak to the patient," he said. "No," Deckard said from the doorway to 312. The word was not loud. It was not aggressive. It had the quality of a door being closed from the inside by someone who had decided that particular door was not going to open tonight. Rusk looked at him. "Sir, you don't have authority here." "Neither do you," Deckard said. "Not over her, not tonight." For approximately 4 seconds, the third-floor hallway contained one of those silences that happen when multiple people had arrived at the point of the situation simultaneously and nobody had moved yet. Then from inside room 312, a sound. It was not loud, not the sound of violence or a monitor alarming. It was the sound of a door. A smaller door inside the room, the bathroom door, and the sound was wrong in the way the guard's posture had been wrong when Deckard first entered, which was that it communicated intention in a space where intention should not have been present. Deckard turned and pushed the main door open. The man they had left in the corner was no longer in the corner. He was standing at the foot of Ren's bed with his right hand inside the front pocket of his scrubs, and the bathroom door beside him was swinging shut, as if someone had just stepped through it from the other side. The bathroom door opened again. The person who came through it was dressed in surgical scrubs, blue well-fitted. A surgical cap covered the hair. A mask covered the face from the nose down. The eyes above the mask were light-colored and calm, not the calm of a person who was comfortable, but the calm of a person who was executing a plan. In the right hand was a scalpel, not raised, not threatening in the theatrical sense, held at the side with the unassuming competence of someone who knew what it could do and did not need to announce it in advance. The person walked toward the bed, not toward Ren's throat, not toward Ren's chest, toward her left arm, toward the bandage, toward the specific location of the thing they had come here to retrieve. Ren saw them coming, and Ren made a decision. She reached across her body with her right hand and found the IV line running from the back of her left hand to the stand beside the bed, the clear plastic tubing with its measured drip of saline and whatever else they had running into her, and she yanked it. Not out. She didn't pull the needle from her hand. She yanked the tubing itself from the connection port, and the disconnection triggered the monitor in the way that disconnections triggered monitors, which was loudly immediately and without any nuance about context. The alarm was not a subtle sound. It was the sound that hospital monitors made when something had gone wrong with a patient in a way that required immediate response from everyone in the building, whose job description included the words patient and emergency in any combination. The person with the scalpel stopped. 2 seconds of the alarm was enough. It was enough for Bain, who had been 6 feet from the door in the hallway, to push the door open and fill the doorway with his physical presence in a way that communicated that the exit route had been revised. It was enough for the charge nurse at the far end of the hall to start moving. It was enough for Deckard to step inside and put himself between the bed and the person who had come out of the bathroom. The person with the scalpel made a fast calculation. They angled toward the door, toward the gap between Deckard and the wall, which was a gap that existed in geometry but not in practice because Bain was filling the doorway, and Bain did not move like a person who was undecided about his position. The scalpel came up, not at Deckard, at the space between Deckard and Bain held out as a definition of personal space rather than a weapon pointed at a specific target, the gesture of someone establishing a perimeter rather than initiating a confrontation. Bain looked at the scalpel. Then, Bain reached out and closed his hand around the wrist holding it. He did not punch the person. He did not strike them in any way. He simply applied the mechanical pressure that a hand the size of Bain's hand could apply to a wrist, the size of this wrist, which was the pressure required to make the wrist understand that the hand was not a negotiating partner. The scalpel fell. It hit the linoleum with a small, bright sound. The person in the surgical mask said something behind the fabric. It was not a word. It was the sound of someone whose plan had reached a dead end at speed. Bain held the wrist. The man from the corner, the one who had been in the room first, made a move toward the door and found Bishop in the doorway, phone recording, body positioned in the entrance. The man stopped. Cassette stepped to Ren's side, reconnected the IV tubing, silenced the monitor alarm with the precise button press of someone who had silenced monitor alarms under worse conditions than this. She looked at Ren's face with the assessment speed of a trauma nurse. "That was smart," Cassette said. "It was loud," Ren said. "Yes," Cassette said. "That's what made it smart." In the hallway, the charge nurse had arrived, followed by 2 hospital security officers from the actual security office responding to the monitor alarm. They took in the scene with the rapidly escalating recognition that happened when what you expected to be a medical event turned out to be a different kind of event entirely. Rusk was in the hallway. He had not moved during the seconds inside the room. He had stayed in the corridor while what happened inside the room happened, which was information by itself because a deputy who heard a monitor alarm from an at-risk patient's room and didn't move toward it was a deputy whose relationship to that patient's safety was not what it was supposed to be. Bishop had moved precisely 2 steps to ensure his camera angle captured the corridor, the door to 312, and Rusk's position in relation to both. The timestamp on the footage would show exactly where everyone was when the alarm went off. The hospital security officers looked at Bain, who was still holding the wrist of the person in the surgical mask. They looked at the man from the corner who had his hands up with the cooperative urgency of someone who had just watched a plan fail at every single juncture. They looked at the scalpel on the floor of room 312 visible through the open door. The senior security officer looked at Cassette. "What happened?" he said. "Two individuals gained unauthorized access to a restricted patient room," Cassette said. "One was already in the room when we entered. The other came through the bathroom, which means there's an exterior access point to that bathroom that needs to be secured immediately. The second individual produced a scalpel and moved toward the patient's left arm." The officer looked at the scalpel. "The patient triggered the monitor alarm herself to bring staff," Cassette said, "which is why you're here." The officer looked at Ren, who was sitting upright in the bed with her IV reattached and her left arm resting across her lap. "Are you hurt?" the officer asked her. "No," Ren said. "Can you tell me what happened?" "He came out of the bathroom," Ren said. "He walked toward my left arm. I disconnected the IV to trigger the alarm." She paused. "He wasn't here to help me." "What was he here for?" the officer asked. Ren looked at the bandage on her left forearm. She looked at Cassette. She looked at Deckard. Then she looked at the officer. "He was here for what I'm carrying," she said, "which is evidence of a crime. And the reason he got access to this room is standing in the hallway right now." The officer turned. Rusk was in the hallway. His arms were loose, his posture arranged into the shape of a man present in an official capacity. But the arrangement was slightly too deliberate. The arms slightly too loose. The jaw slightly too set. Bishop's camera caught all of it. "Who authorized the security post in this room?" Cassette asked Rusk from inside the doorway. "Because the charge nurse's log has no badge number." And the officer posted outside the main door hesitated when I asked him the same question. Rusk looked at her. "Security management," he said. "Name," Bishop said. Rusk's eyes moved to the camera. "You're recording a law enforcement officer," Rusk said. "I'm recording a hallway," Bishop said, "in which a law enforcement officer is present." The man in Bane's grip said something behind his surgical mask. The tone was the tone of someone making an argument for why his current situation was a misunderstanding. "Take that off," the security officer said, gesturing to the mask. The man in Bane's grip reached up with his free hand and pulled the mask down. His face was unremarkable in the way that people who did this kind of work were often unremarkable, with features that were average in every dimension, and a look about the eyes of someone who had learned that forgettable was a professional asset. He was approximately 40, with the build of a person who stayed in physical condition because his job required it. He looked at Rusk. Rusk did not look at him. The man understood this as the message it was. He looked at Bishop's camera instead, and after approximately 3 seconds of apparent calculation, he said, "We were told she needed medication, that she'd react badly without it, that it was a welfare intervention." The hallway absorbed this. "Told by who?" Bishop said. The man looked at Rusk. Rusk's expression was very still now. "I want to be clear," Bishop said, "that this is being recorded and that the timestamp will be preserved and that anything said in this hallway in the next several minutes will be part of a documented record." The man in Bane's grip said, "The deputy. He said the girl had a condition. He said the hospital wasn't managing it properly. He said we needed to administer something to stabilize her before she could be safely transferred." And the charge nurse made an involuntary sound. Rusk said, "That's a lie, so." His voice was still controlled, but the quality of the control had changed. It had moved from the control of someone managing a complex situation professionally to the control of someone managing a situation that had become personal. "Turn that off," he said to Bishop. "No," Bishop said. Rusk took a step toward Bishop. Deckard took a step toward Rusk. They were not touching. Nobody was touching anybody. It was a corridor with people in specific positions, and between the two nearest positions, there was approximately 5 feet of carpet and institutional silence. Cassette said, "State is 10 minutes out." She was looking at her phone. "I have a confirmation text, 2 units, coming directly to this floor." Rusk went still. The stillness of a man who had just had the terminal condition of his timeline confirmed. He looked at the hallway. He looked at the riders distributed along its length, calm position watching. He looked at Bishop's phone. He looked at Deckard, who was 5 feet away, with nothing in his hands and nothing performative in his expression. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Rusk said. Deckard looked at him for a moment. We stopped a highway today, Deckard said. This is easier. Rusk's jaw moved. He straightened his belt. He looked at the man in Bain's grip with the look of someone revising what was salvageable from a situation and arriving at an uncomfortable number. Then he turned and walked to the elevator. Bishop tracked him with the camera until the elevator doors opened and Rusk stepped inside. Bishop kept recording until the doors closed. He lowered the phone. He's not leaving, Deckard said. No, Bishop said. He's repositioning. Inside room 312, Wren had watched the hallway through the open door with the complete focused attention of someone taking inventory. She had watched Rusk's face during the moment when the man in Bain's grip had implicated him. She had watched the stillness when State's arrival was confirmed. She had watched the way he walked to the elevator, not the walk of a man who had lost, but the walk of a man whose timeline had compressed. She looked at the bandage on her left forearm. She looked at Cassette. They're going to try something else, Wren said. Before State gets here, he knows he has 10 minutes. Cassette looked at her. What do you want to do? Cassette said. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. Not the kind of question adults ask teenagers when they had already decided what was going to happen and were performing the consultation. It was the question of someone who understood that the person in the bed had been making better decisions than most of the people in the building for the past 3 weeks and had earned the right to be asked. Wren thought for exactly 4 seconds. I want someone outside every access point on this floor, she said. Stairs, elevators, the service corridor if there is one. I want someone in this room who isn't going to leave regardless of what anyone tells them. And I want the drive documented in its current location, photographed in place before anything else happens to the chain of custody. She paused. And I want someone to find my sister, she said. Her name is Tess. She's been looking for me. Someone has been making sure she couldn't find me. Her voice had a different quality on this last part, not harder, but thinner, like something stretched over a frame. She's real. She exists. I need someone to prove that the calls she made went somewhere they shouldn't have gone. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Deckard turned to the doorway and spoke quietly into the corridor. Bain, he said. Bain, who had handed off the man in the surgical mask to the hospital security officers and was standing in the hallway with his arms folded, turned his head. You're staying in this room, Deckard said. Bain turned and walked into room 312 and positioned himself beside the door with his back to the wall and his eyes on the room, which was the position he would maintain for the next 10 minutes, while state units climbed the stairs in the hallway outside, shifted from the crisis it had been toward the beginning of what came after crisis, which was harder in different ways and required different things from different people. Wren lay back against the elevated bed and looked at the ceiling. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her left forearm. Still there. Outside, somewhere below, the parking lot held 500 motorcycles, and the orange glow of the streetlights catching chrome, and beyond the parking lot, the road ran in both directions into a dark that was not yet finished with this day. The state investigators arrived the way competent people arrived in serious situations, without announcement, without drama, simply present in a way that made the hallway feel like it had finally found the people it had been waiting for. 2 plainclothes investigators came through the stairwell door first. A uniformed state trooper followed. Then a second trooper, and behind them a woman who moved with the readiness of someone who had been reading rooms professionally for long enough that the reading had become involuntary. She was in her mid-40s, close-cropped hair, no jewelry, a jacket that said state in the way that certain jackets said things without having the word printed on them. Her eyes went to Bishop first, then to the camera, then to the door of room 312, then to the man from the surgical mask who was sitting against the hallway wall with his wrists secured by a hospital security officer who looked relieved to be handing the problem to someone with more jurisdiction. She identified herself as Investigator Claire Maddox. She did not shake anyone's hand. She looked at the room, at the riders distributed along the corridor, at the scalpel still visible through the open door of 312, and she said, "Give me the sequence." Cassette gave it. She was precise and clinical and did not editorialize, which was the most effective kind of testimony because it left no surface for skepticism to grip. Investigator Maddox listened without interrupting. When Cassett finished, Maddox looked at Bishop. "You have footage." "From the lobby forward," Bishop said, "including the hallway on this floor, including Deputy Rusk's position relative to the alarm event." "I'll need a copy." "You'll have it," Bishop said. Maddox turned to the uniformed trooper. "I want this floor secured." Stairwell access logged. Elevator controlled nobody on or off without my authorization. She looked at the hospital security officer. That applies to your staff as well. Anyone who was on this floor in the past 2 hours gets interviewed before they go home. The security officer nodded with the expression of someone genuinely relieved to be receiving clear instructions. Maddox walked to the door of room 312 and stopped at the threshold. She looked at Ren. Ren looked back. "You're the patient," Maddox said. "Yes," Ren said. "Are you able to talk?" "Yes," Ren said. "Son, sit." Maddox stepped inside. She pulled the chair from beside the bed and sat in it, which put her below Ren's eye level, which Ren noticed. "I've been told you have something," Maddox said, "and I've been told you've been carrying it for 19 days under significant pressure. Before I ask you anything about it, I want to tell you something." She paused. "Whatever's on that drive, the decision about what happens to it is going to involve lawyers and judges and processes that are bigger than this room. My job tonight is not to take it from you. My job is to make sure it gets where it needs to go in a way that can actually be used. There's a difference." Ren studied her. "Who do you work for?" Ren asked. "State Criminal Investigations Unit," Maddox said. "Not local, not county." "Rusk is county," Ren said. Yes," Maddox said. "And he knew I was here before the hospital had my name?" Ren said, "Which means someone told him." "We're looking at that," Maddox said. Ren was quiet for a moment. Outside in the hallway, the low professional murmur of the investigation organizing itself moved through the door, specific and purposeful. She could hear Deckard's voice somewhere in it, not the words, just the particular cadence of someone answering questions with the directness of a person who had nothing to protect except the truth. "The drive was in a van," Ren said. "Blue circle logo, white letters shaped like a wave. The van was at the Kellerman Freight Yard west side of the county approximately 3 in the morning and 19 days ago." She described what she had seen with the flat precision of someone who had rehearsed the account in her head many times, not for performance, but because she had understood from the beginning that if she ever got to say it out loud, it would need to be exact. 2 men, one directing, one assisting, a third man removed from the back of the van and placed in a container in the storage section. The man directing had a ring on his left hand. Gold band, dark stone, wide setting. I saw it clearly in the interior light of the van. "And you identified that ring subsequently," Maddox said. "On the hand of Deputy Harlan Rusk," Ren said, "when he came into my trauma bay tonight and told me to give it back." The younger investigator's pen moved. "The drive fell from the van during acceleration," Ren continued. "I retrieved it. I secured it on my person because I understood that without physical evidence, the account of a 15-year-old girl with no fixed address and no documentation would not be sufficient to initiate any meaningful investigation." Maddox looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had interviewed a great many witnesses in a great many conditions and was recalibrating her expectations of this one. "Where is it now?" Maddox said. Ren held out her left arm. Maddox looked at the bandage. She looked at the position of the IV line relative to the bandage. She looked at the care of the construction, the deliberate placement that had kept a piece of evidence hidden through an ambulance transport, a trauma bay assessment, a floor transfer, a blood draw, a monitor placement, and 2 unauthorized access attempts by people who had been specifically looking for it. "I need a forensic technician to photograph it in place before it's removed." Maddox said not to Ren but to the door. The younger investigator relayed the request into his radio. "I need one more thing," Ren said. Maddox looked at her. "My sister," Ren said. "Her name is Tess. She's 23. She's been filing missing person reports for weeks." Something moved through Ren's voice on this, not enough to break the surface, but enough to change the texture of it. "None of them reached the right places. I need you to find out where they went." Maddox held her gaze. "What's her last name?" "Calloway," Ren said. "Tess Calloway. She lives in Ardmore on the east side." Maddox wrote it down herself in her own notebook with her own pen in a way that communicated the writing was not procedural. It was a commitment. "I'll find her," Maddox said. She stood, replaced the chair, and walked to the door. She stopped with one hand on the frame and turned back. "You did well," Maddox said. 19 days is a long time to hold something like that." Ren looked at the bandage on her left forearm. "I didn't have anywhere to put it down," she said. In the hallway, the investigation was assembling itself with the brisk efficiency of a state-level operation that had been given a specific set of facts and a specific set of problems and was now applying the appropriate resources to both. Camera footage requests had gone to hospital administration. The charge nurse was being interviewed by the younger investigator. The man from the surgical mask had been formally detained. The man who had been positioned outside 312 in the incorrect uniform was being questioned at the far end of the corridor. Deckard stood near the nurse's station and watched. He had answered Maddox's questions thoroughly. He had described the highway, the stop, the girl on the shoulder, the convoy's decision to escort the ambulance, the events in the lobby from Ward's arrival forward, Rusk's presence, the monitor alarm, everything in sequence with the flat accuracy of someone who had been present for all of it and remembered it with the clarity that came from understanding that you were inside something important while it was happening. "Rusk," Deckard said when Maddox came out of the room. He took the elevator. "We have the exits covered," Maddox said. "He's not leaving the property." "You're sure," Deckard said. "2 units at the main entrance when we arrived," Maddox said. "2 more at the service exit. I issued the instruction before we came up." She looked at him with the expression of someone used to being asked to justify their preparation. "He's on the property." Deckard nodded. "And Ward," he said. Maddox looked at him for a moment. "You know that name," she said. "He came in with guardianship paperwork," Deckard said, "before the hospital had the girl's name. He didn't know the street she grew up on." He paused. "He left when we pushed back, but he didn't look like he was done." Maddox turned to the trooper at the elevator. "I need a location on a Graham Ward," she said. "White male, late 30s, suit, dark folder. He left through the main entrance within the last 2 hours." She paused. "Check the service lane." The trooper relayed it. Deckard moved to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked down over the hospital's service lane. He looked through the narrow pane, angling his body to see down along the side of the building. The service lane was not empty. A dark van was parked partially behind the loading dock overhang, positioned in the way that a vehicle was positioned when the driver wanted it accessible without being immediately visible from the main road. Its headlights were off. Something about the stillness of the vehicle was the stillness of an engine running rather than an engine off. A readiness. And beside the van, standing with his folder still under his arm and his phone to his ear, and his posture communicating no emergency whatsoever, was Graham Ward. Deckard did not move immediately from the window. He looked at Ward for 5 seconds, the way you looked at something you needed to understand fully before deciding what to do with the understanding. Ward was not rushing. Ward was not scanning the building with the anxiety of someone whose plan had failed. He was standing beside a dark van in a hospital service lane at night with the patience of a man who had done his calculation and arrived at a number he was comfortable with. People who improvised showed urgency. People who had backup plans didn't need to. Deckard turned from the window and found Maddox 6 feet away. "Service lane," he said. "Dark van. Ward is beside it. He's on the phone." Maddox moved without rushing, which meant she was moving fast. She spoke into her radio. "Service lane. Dark van occupant matching Ward description. Do not approach alone. Hold position and maintain visual." She looked at the trooper. "2 units to the service lane now. Approach from the exterior, not through the building." The trooper went. Deckard looked back through the window. Ward was still there. And then Deckard saw the rear door of the van visible from this angle as a thin vertical line of darker darkness against the dark body of the vehicle, and the line was not the line of a closed door. It was open by approximately 6 inches, the width of ventilation, or the width of a door held from the inside. Deckard stared at it. "There's someone in the van," he said. Maddox came to the window. She looked. She saw what Deckard had seen. "The service lane units need to look at the rear," she said into her radio. "The rear door of the van is not fully closed. Approach from both sides simultaneously. Do not let the vehicle move." Below, Ward's phone came away from his ear. He looked at it. He looked at the building. Something in the quality of his stillness changed, not dramatically, but in the way a person's stillness changed when the information they had just received had revised their timeline. He looked at the van. He made a decision, and the decision was visible in the way he moved toward the driver's door. Not hurrying, still maintaining the posture of a man with legitimate business, but moving with a purposefulness that had abandoned the patience of the previous minutes. From below, headlights appeared at both ends of the service lane, Simultaneously, state units arriving from the building's exterior and the way they positioned across the lane entrances removed the van's exit options in approximately 4 seconds. Ward stopped with his hand on the driver's door. He looked at the lights. He looked at the units. He looked at the building. He pulled the door open and threw the van into gear. The engine roared. The van lurched forward, tires scrabbling on the wet concrete of the service lane, nosing hard toward the gap between the two state units, looking for the angle that would get it through before the units closed. The units didn't close. They held their positions, and the troopers got out fast, and one of them raised his weapon and his voice at the same time, and the voice said stop, and the van didn't stop, and what came next was the sound that Deckard had heard before in other contexts, and that was unmistakable regardless of context. A single shot, not at the driver, at the front left tire. The tire blew with a sound like a fist hitting a table, sudden and flat, and the van lurched sideways and the front corner dropped, and the van ground forward for another 10 feet on the ruined rim before the physics of the situation made further forward motion impossible, and the van stopped, engine still running, the front left corner of it 6 inches from the state unit's bumper. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the engine idling and the hiss of the destroyed tire. Then doors opened. Troopers converged. Ward was pulled from the driver's side with the rapid, practiced efficiency of people who did not want to give a man with a plan the seconds a plan required. He went to the ground. His folder hit the concrete of the service lane, and the papers scattered in the draft, the guardianship documents and the medical history and the release authorization spreading across the wet ground like things that had forgotten what they were for. The rear door of the van was pulled open. A hospital worker in scrubs fell rather than stepped out, his legs not fully cooperating, his wrists red where something had been around them. He sat down on the concrete of the service lane and breathed the open air with the deliberate concentration of someone reminding their body what air was supposed to feel like. A trooper crouched beside him. "Can you tell me your name?" the trooper said. The man said his name. He said he worked in hospital administration. He said he had been told he needed to authorize some access logs for a patient transfer. And when he said no, things had happened quickly after that. He said he had been in the van for he didn't know how long. He said he was cold. A second trooper draped a foil blanket over his shoulders. Ward was in cuffs on the pavement. His face was turned sideways against the concrete, and the clean composure he had carried through the lobby and the hallway and the parking lot and the service lane had finally left him replaced by something raw and less managed. His eyes were open. He was looking at the scattered papers near his face, the documents he had prepared so carefully lying in the water on the service lane concrete. Deckard watched from the third-floor window until the units had Ward in a vehicle, and the hospital employee was sitting on the loading dock with his blanket and the van's doors were secured. Then he turned from the window and walked back to room 312. Bain was still in this corner where Deckard had left him, back to the wall, eyes on the room, arms folded. Cassette was beside Wren's bed. The forensic technician, a quiet man in his 30s who had arrived with the state team, was documenting the bandage on Wren's left forearm with the focused attention of a person whose job was to make the informal formal. Wren was watching the technician work. "Ward is in custody," Deckard said from the door. Cassette looked up. Wren's eyes came to him. "He's in the service lane," Deckard said. "State units." Wren absorbed this. She looked at the bandage, at the technician's careful work, at the small flat drive being photographed in place against her skin. "And Rusk," she said. "Still on the property," Deckard said. "Maddox has the exits." Maddox appeared in the doorway. "Rusk was located in the hospital parking structure," she said. "East stairwell level 2. He was attempting to reach a personal vehicle." She looked at Wren. "He's in custody. He's not going anywhere." Wren looked at her for a moment. "The ring," Wren said. "It's been photographed and will be logged as evidence," Maddox said. "Consistent with your description." Wren looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at Maddox. "There's a man," Wren said. "The man they put in the container. 19 days ago." She held Maddox's gaze with the directness of someone asking a question they were not entirely certain they wanted answered. "Did you find him?" Maddox was quiet for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Wren's hands tightened on the blanket by a fraction. "Yes," Maddox said. Wren waited. "He's alive," Maddox said. "We located him this morning based on the container identification visible in the footage. The container had a ventilation system and he had access to water. He's been transported to a medical facility. He's alive. The room absorbed this. Ren's face did something that was not a large movement and was not small. It was the movement of a face that had been holding a specific weight for 19 days and had just been told it could set that weight down. Not all of it, not the cost of the 19 days, which would be paid over a much longer period, but the specific weight of not knowing the weight, of having seen something and not being certain that seeing it had mattered. That weight moved through her expression and settled somewhere different, somewhere lower and less acute. He saw me, Ren said almost to herself, in the culvert. He looked right at the grate. She paused. I always wondered if that was better or worse for him. Knowing someone saw. It was better, Cassette said. Same words Deckard had said in the same room hours ago. She said them without knowing he had said them, which meant she had arrived at them the same way he had, through the same reasoning, and they were true from both directions. Ren looked at the bandage on her left forearm, at the place where the drive had been for 19 days, and she nodded once to herself, to the room, to no one in particular. Okay, she said. The word was different from every other time she had said it that night. It was not strategic. It was not a placeholder for information being processed. It was simply what it was, the sound of someone arriving at a place they had been trying to reach for a very long time. The forensic technician completed his documentation and looked at Cassette. Cassette looked at Ren. Ready, Cassette said. Yes, Ren said. Cassette removed the bandage with the careful efficiency she applied to everything clinical, unwrapping the gauze from the outside and peeling back the layers with the attention of someone who understood that what was underneath had been someone's only protection for 19 days and deserved to be handled accordingly. The tape came last, gentle and slow. And then the drive was free, and Cassette placed it in the small evidence envelope the technician held open, and the technician sealed it and initialed the seal and dated it, and the drive that had been taped against Ren's skin through drainage culverts and dollar store runs and a highway shoulder and a trauma bay and a hospital room and 2 unauthorized access attempts became, in that sealed envelope, a piece of evidence with a chain of custody that would be very difficult to argue with in any court that cared about documentation. Ren looked at her left forearm. The skin where the tape had been was slightly pink, slightly indented, the temporary mark of something that had been pressed against it long enough to leave an impression. She looked at it the way you looked at a mark left by something important, with the recognition that it had been there, and now it was going somewhere that could use it better than her forearm could. What happens to it now? She asked. State Forensic Lab, Cassette said. Logged, analyzed, cataloged. Every frame of whatever's on it preserved. And what they did to the man in the container, that's what the investigation is for, Cassette said. Ren was quiet. Then Investigator Maddox appeared in the doorway again, and this time her expression had changed in a way that was not official and not procedural. It was the expression of someone delivering information that belongs to a person and not to a case file. We found her, Maddox said. Ren looked at her. Tess, Maddox said. She's been filing reports every 72 hours since you disappeared. 17 reports over 19 days. Every one of them received at the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. She paused. Rusk's department. 12 were logged and closed within 24 hours as unfounded. The other 5 were never entered into the system at all. The room was very still. She didn't stop, Maddox said. Not once. Ren's face did the thing it had been doing and fighting all night, the thing that happened when a face that had been held in controlled neutrality for a very long time received information that the neutrality was protecting against a feeling too large for the structure, keeping it contained. Her eyes went bright, and her jaw moved once, finding a new position, and she looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way people looked at ceilings when they needed a direction to look that wasn't at another person. Is she here? Ren said. She's on her way, Maddox said. 40 minutes. Ren nodded. She looked at her left arm, at the faintly marked skin, at the IV line running into the back of her hand, at the monitor recording her pulse with the steady arithmetic of a body that had decided to continue. Okay, she said. The word had everything in it. Maddox left to manage the hallway. Cassette stayed. Inside. Bain stayed. Deckard stayed in the doorway and watched the corridor, which was occupied by state personnel, doing their work with the focused efficiency of people who had been given a clear problem and the appropriate tools. The riders who had held the hallway for the last 2 hours were repositioning filtering back toward the stairwell and the elevator, not because anyone had told them to, but because they understood that the function they had been performing was being assumed by people with more formal authority, and their job now was to be available rather than primary. Bishop came to stand beside Deckard. Ward's driver's license was real, Bishop said. The name, the address. That means the guardianship documentation was probably formally constructed. This is a level of organization above what you set up in an afternoon. We knew that, Deckard said. Yes, Bishop said. What it means for the investigation is that whoever is at the top of this has been running operations long enough to have legal infrastructure in place. Ward is not the principal. No, Deckard agreed. The drive might be, Bishop said. Deckard looked at the door of 312. Then it matters what's on it, he said. It always did, Bishop said. Cassette sat with Wren. They did not talk very much. This was not awkward. It was the particular companionable quiet of two people who had been through something together that did not require narration. Cassette had brought a cup of tea from somewhere, actual tea, from a thermos that someone in the convoy apparently carried, which said something about the convoy's general level of preparation. Wren held the cup with both hands and let the warmth move into her fingers, which were still cold in the way that people who had been very cold for a long time were still cold even after the temperature around them had improved. Does it get easier? Wren said. Cassette looked at her. What specifically? Cassette said. Not trusting things to stay okay, Wren said. Every time something goes right, I'm already waiting for the thing that comes after it that makes it wrong. Cassette considered this without looking for the reassuring answer. It gets different, she said. You start recognizing the pattern. You start being able to tell the difference between the thing that's actually coming and the thing you're afraid is coming. They're not the same thing. How long does that take? Wren said. Longer than tonight, Cassette said, but shorter than you think. Wren drank her tea. At approximately 9:40 in the evening, Tess Calloway arrived at St. Carver Medical. She came through the main entrance with the energy of someone who had been in motion for hours and was still in motion and would remain in motion until she reached the specific point that all the motion had been directed toward. She was 23 slight, with the same dark eyes as her sister, and the kind of face that communicated everything it was feeling without apparent effort or intention. She had been on the phone with Maddox's office for the 40 minutes of the drive, and she knew the broad shape of what had happened, and knowing the broad shape had not reduced her urgency by any detectable amount. A state investigator met her at the entrance, verified her identity against 3 separate forms of documentation, and then walked her to the elevator. She came off the elevator onto the 3rd floor at a speed slightly below running. Deckard stepped aside from the door of 312. Tess stopped in the hallway looking at the door. She was breathing fast. Her hands were at her sides. Fingers open, and the openness of them had the look of someone who had been reaching for something for a very long time and was now standing close enough that the reaching felt dangerous, as if hope was a thing that could be broken by the final moment before it was confirmed. She looked at Deckard. He gestured toward the door. She pushed it open. Deckard did not watch what happened inside. He turned toward the corridor and looked at the hallway and the nurse's station and the trooper at the elevator and the art prints on the wall that had been selected by someone who believed nature photography could absorb human anxiety, and he let the sounds from inside room 312 exist without attaching to them specifically because that moment was not for him, and he knew it. He heard Tess say one thing through the door before it swung shut. I never stopped, she said. I need you to know that. I never stopped. He didn't hear what Wren said back. He didn't need to. Bishop came to stand beside him. They were quiet for a while. The convoy's going to want to know she's okay, Bishop said eventually. I know, Deckard said. Half of them are still in the parking lot, Bishop said. It's almost 10 o'clock. I know, Deckard said again. He thought about the freight yard on the west side of the county, about a man being walked into a container in the dark, about a 15-year-old girl pressing her face against a drainage grate and making a calculation that most adults would not have made, about 19 days of cold and hunger, and the intelligence of someone who had understood that the only thing standing between a piece of evidence and the people who wanted it gone was her own capacity to hold on. He thought about jumping from a moving van at 60 miles an hour because the alternative was worse. He thought about the words she had said on the highway's shoulder, the only words she had managed before consciousness left her again. Van. Not help, not scared, not please. Van. Even at the edge of everything, she had been filing information. She had been doing the work. She had been holding the thread even when the thread was the only thing left. He found he did not have any particular reflection to make about this. It was simply a fact, and facts of that size didn't need elaboration. The morning arrived without ceremony. Hospitals didn't mark mourning the way the outside world marked it. There was no specific moment when the night ended and the day began. There was a gradual brightening of certain lights, a change in foot traffic, a shift in the sounds from the nurse's station. But the transition happened in the same institutional fluorescent hum as everything else. And you knew it was morning because the coffee in the vending machine started being purchased more frequently, and because the faces of the night staff had acquired the look of people approaching the end of a long passage. Wren had slept for 4 hours, which Cassette confirmed was more than she had probably slept in any single stretch for the past 3 weeks. Tess had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, with her head tilted against the wall and her right hand resting on the blanket near Wren's left arm, not touching, but close. Maddox appeared on the 3rd floor at 7:15. She found Deckard in the family waiting area at the end of the hall, sitting with a cup of vending machine coffee that he was holding more than drinking. She sat in the adjacent chair and looked at the window at the end of the room, which showed a sky working on becoming something more specific. "The drive," she said. "Preliminary analysis ran overnight. There's video, 47 minutes of continuous footage from a fixed angle inside the freight yard. It captures the van, the men, the container, and approximately 14 minutes of additional activity I can't describe in detail, but that is sufficient to initiate a federal investigation in addition to the state charges." Deckard looked at his coffee. "And the man in the container," he said. "He's alive," Maddox said. "We located him this morning based on the container identification visible in the footage. He's been in that container for 19 days. The container had industrial ventilation and a supply line the occupant managed to access. He's been transported to a medical facility." She paused. "He's alive and he's coherent," and his first question, when the troopers opened the container, was whether the girl who had been at the yard that night was safe. Deckard put his coffee down on the side table. He sat with that for a moment. 19 days. The same 19 days Wren had been in a culvert, in a drainage pipe, in the spaces between places, holding a piece of evidence that was the only thing keeping a man in a container from becoming a man who had disappeared and whom no one would ever locate. "She saved him," Deckard said. "She preserved the evidence that allowed us to locate him," Maddox said with the precision of someone who understood that the legal accuracy of a statement mattered. Then she paused. "Yes," she said. "She saved him." Deckard was quiet. He had already told Wren the man was alive, and he knew from the way she had received that information that it had mattered to her in the way that mattered most. Not as a strategic success, but as a confirmation that what she had done in the dark of a freight yard drainage culvert, what she had decided to carry and keep and protect at personal cost, she was still paying, had been worth something real to a real person. Real. That was enough. That was more than enough. At 8:40, Wren was discharged from St. Carver Medical into the joint custody of Tess Calloway. In the state's protective arrangement, a structure that Maddox had described in terms that were formal, but that functionally meant Tess was going to take her home, and the state was going to make sure nobody made that complicated. The discharge was supposed to be a routine clinical process. It was not. Deckard had gone down to the lobby at 8, and what he found there was what had been accumulating in the parking lot overnight, which was most of the convoy still there. Engines, cold riders standing or sitting beside their bikes in the early morning, gray with the patient, unhurried quality of people who had decided they were not leaving until a specific thing had happened, and the specific thing had not yet happened. Nobody had organized this. Nobody had sent a message or issued a directive. It had simply happened the way things happen in groups that shared a sufficiently clear understanding of what mattered. Deckard looked at them through the glass for a moment. He went back upstairs. He found Maddox and told her what was in the parking lot. Maddox looked at him. "She should go out the front," she said, "not the service entrance." "Yes," Deckard agreed. They asked Wren. Wren was dressed in clothes that Tess had brought, not the hospital gown and not the destroyed clothing from the highway, real clothes her own size that Tess had stopped at a store to buy on the drive over the previous night, because that was the kind of thing Tess had calculated in transit. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her feet on the floor and her left arm bare of the bandage, now the skin still faintly marked, and she was looking at the door with the expression of someone deciding something. "The front," she said. "Yes," Cassette said. "The front." Wren stood. They went down by the elevator. Maddox came. Cassett came. Tess walked beside Wren with the awareness of someone who understood that proximity mattered and was calibrating the exact proximity that was supportive without being constraining. The elevator opened onto the lobby, and then Wren stopped. Because the lobby was not the lobby she had been brought into the previous afternoon on a gurney with her eyes closed. The lobby was lined, on both sides of the path from the elevator to the main entrance, beginning at the elevator doors and extending through the lobby and out the automatic main doors and down the steps and across the hospital's front approach to the parking lot beyond. There were riders, helmets in their hands, not on their heads, vests, patches, gray beards, and the weathered faces of people who had been on the road for a long time and understood something about distance and what it cost and what it was worth. They were not making noise, not a ceremony, not a parade, just a corridor, just people standing in a configuration that communicated a thing without requiring it to be said. Wren stood at the elevator and then looked at the length of it. She looked at the faces nearest her. The man with the white hair, the woman with the road name on her vest, the big quiet man who had been in her room all night and was now in the corridor with his arms at his sides instead of folded. She looked at Deckard. He was standing at the point where the lobby met the first of the outdoor steps, two-thirds of the way down the corridor of riders facing toward her. He had his helmet in his right hand, and his left hand was at his side, and his expression was the expression he had worn all night, which was the expression of a man who had decided where he was going to be and was simply being there with no drama about it. Wren walked forward. She walked the length of the corridor at the pace of someone who was choosing to take her time, because there was, for the first time in 19 days, time to take. She looked at the faces as she passed them, not with shyness and not with performance, but with the direct, clear attention of someone cataloging things she wanted to remember. She passed the man with the white hair. She passed the woman with the road name. She passed Bain, who was watching the room as he always watched rooms, and whose expression when she passed him changed by exactly the amount it was going to change, which was a small amount, but real. She reached Deckard. She stopped. She looked up at him. He looked at her. She nodded. Once slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about what the gesture meant before making it. He nodded back. That was all. She walked through the automatic doors and down the steps and into the early morning gray of the parking lot. And behind her, the convoy began quietly one by one to put their helmets on. Outside, the world was the particular color of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it was going to be, gray and flat and open in every direction. Traffic on the road beyond the parking lot moved with the ordinary purposefulness of people going to ordinary places, and some of them slowed as they passed because in the parking lot of St. Carver Medical, there were 500 motorcycles and a girl walking through them with a woman beside her, and the sight was singular enough that even people with somewhere to be took a moment to look. The girl walked like someone who had been moving under constraint for a long time and had recently been reminded that the constraint was not the natural condition of motion. She walked like someone who was going to be all right. Not today completely, not without Austin, not without the long work of what came after a thing like this, but in the direction of all right, which was what mattered, which was what the direction of all right always meant. Behind her, the first engine turned over, then another. Then the sound built the way it always built, from single voices to something collective, something that was not any one machine, but all of them together, the sound of 500 engines that had stopped once for a girl on a highway shoulder and were now in the gray morning beginning to move again. Not a parade this time, just the sound of people going home.